What's up, guys? Coach Austin here again. What we're going to talk about is FTP. What is FTP? Why is it important? And all things related. I teach spin, and people on a regular basis come in and I refer to FTP. I say, all right, for the first interval, we're going to do 100% of FTP. And people are like, what? What's FTP? Firstly, they don't know because they're not consistent with my class. But that doesn't matter. We teach them so that they can become more consistent. So FTP stands for Functional Threshold Power. FTP is mostly referred to people when they're on the bike. Now, if you were to run a 5K or a 10K or a half marathon or a marathon, you have a functional threshold pace. Or if you use a stride power meter, you can also have a functional threshold power on your run as well. But when referring to swimming or referring to running, we can use functional threshold pace unless we have that power metric. Why is FTP important? FTP is important because that tells you your highest sustainable effort for a given time. If anyone ever tells you their FTP, your first question, or my first question always is, for what distance, right? When you test for your FTP, you always have to test. Now, there's many different tests you can do. Some people do 2 by 8 minutes at the hardest effort they could sustain. Some people do a 20-minute test or a 40-minute test or a 60-minute test. That's called an FTP 20 or an FTP 40 or an FTP 60. That is your baseline. Whenever you're starting to do something with swim, bike, or run, you always need a baseline. Just like when you're trying to lose weight, you want to take a before picture, right? Because you want to know exactly, how much weight you lost, where you lost it. So at the beginning of your fitness regimen, you need to do an FTP test. If you're doing it in the pool, it could be 500 yards all out after a good warm-up. If you're doing it in the run, you need to choose the distance you're doing your threshold test. Right? You need to keep in mind when choosing the duration of your threshold test, what test is going to be most functional for the distance or the activity that you're doing. And it goes both ways, because if you choose an FTP 60 where you're going as hard as you can for 60 minutes, that's probably going to take a pretty big toll on your body. It's going to take several days to recover, and that might actually negatively impact your fitness because you become less likely to exercise the next day. Whereas you could do an FTP 20 and you can sort of calculate. There's certain ways to calculate depending on what type of athlete you are. You can usually, take away about 8% of an FTP 20 and usually ballpark what someone's functional threshold power for a 60-minute test will be. So your threshold will only stay consistent for certain amount of weeks with consistent training. So when you know your FTP, it's like a bucket full of water. Your lactic acid builds up faster than you can filter it out. If like pouring a water into a bucket, if the bucket's full of water and it starts draining out because it has a hole in the bottom, you got to pour in water at the same speed it's pouring out, and that keeps the bucket full. Now, if you're below your threshold, then you filter out. That water represents lactic acid. You actually end up filtering out all the lactic acid or water, for the analogy, and then you're not really pushing it that hard. But what real FTP, or functional threshold power or pace, is supposed to do is you're supposed to get warmed up, you go really hard, you find an effort that is as hard as you can go, that's sustainable for a certain given distance, and that's how much lactic acid you're able to sustain. You start increasing the amount in your body, and the water that you're pouring in is the effort that you're pouring in, and your body is doing its darndest to filter out the lactic acid, but your effort is creating more. So functional threshold power is really a good indication of telling us where your lactate threshold is another word for it. And so you can use that given FTP result to gauge intervals or how hard you should go. You can use power as an FTP. You can use pace as as a threshold. You can use your heart rate as a threshold. For example, an athlete's threshold during the heart rate during a 5K might be 169, but during an Olympic distance, they found out that their heart rate threshold is actually a little bit lower for 162, or it's 169. So by doing the test, you know what the highest sustainable effort is. Whatever metric you decide to measure it with, it's fine. Use anyone, but you need to have a number to measure it. Whether that's, I can hold my fastest pace is going to be 7 minutes per mile for 6 miles, right? So, that would give you about 42 minutes. That would be an FTP 40. Or if you wanted to do, a 20-minute test in the water, which could be X amount of yards depending on what your past experience is. So hopefully that gives you some insight to your threshold test. And if you have any questions, feel free to comment below, like and subscribe, and I'll do my best to make a video especially for you to answer your questions. Later.